Hello, everybody, and welcome to RegTech Talk, the financial fraud crisis. I wanted to give you a little bit of an introduction to RegTech Talks itself as an initiative before we go into all of the speakers that we have for today. So we've launched RegTech Talks just over a year ago. We launched it as an event in Leeds, a real event. One of the speakers that we had was actually from our headline sponsor today, Record Shaw. And since then, we've been running RegTech Talks in various different industries, things like the energy industry, the manufacturing industry, and today we obviously want to talk about the financial industry. So the reason that we wanted to put RegTech Talks together as an initiative is because compliance plays a vital role in safeguarding both consumers and companies. And the more important your industry is, the higher regulated that you are. So if you are having to deal with a lot of regulations, it means that you're doing something really important. It means that what you're doing is something that is an absolute pillar to the societies that we live in. And the reason that we wanted to talk about technology in that side is that technology is being implemented in every single industry across the world. And we think that because compliance is so important and it's so vital to everything that we do, technology should be at the core of how we go forward in terms of things like regulatory compliance in every single industry. During the last 6 months, it's been a complete roller coaster for absolutely everybody in every single industry. And it's sad to say that anytime there is any sort of crisis, global or national, you always see a spike in crime in general. So we've seen everything from websites selling fake PPE, scam medical campaigns, email phishing campaigns, to really prey on people who have been hit the worst by the global pandemic. And that's the reason that we wanted to bring this event to the fore to talk about how things have been affected within the financial industry, get some insight from our speakers who have been working on the very front line of the financial crisis during the pandemic, and what they see for the future, hopefully giving us some gleams of light to look forward to over what is going to be a very rocky next few months. So I'm going to pass you over to Stephen, who is going to be chairing the event for the rest of the afternoon. If you want any more information on RegTech Talks as an initiative, you go to regtechtalks.co.uk. We'll be doing a write-up of this event. We have the write-ups of all of our other events, and we do insightful blog posts sort of every few weeks just about different regulatory compliance in different industries. So I'll pass this over to Stephen now. He's going to ask you to put all of your questions into the Q&A. And thank you very much. I hope that you enjoy today.
Thanks, Georgia. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I am your host for this evening, as they say. I'm really pleased to be able to tell you about some of the speakers we've got. Fantastic speakers to kind of share some things with you. So first off, we'll hear from Sarah Armstrong-Smith, who's Chief Security Officer at Microsoft. And Sarah's going to talk to us about the changing paradigm and threats from remote working. So I think we're all familiar with remote working by now, but I think it'll be really interesting to hear more about that from Sarah. We have Joe Norburn, who's CEO of Record Shaw, who's going to talk to us about how you ensure good customer outcomes and managing risk whilst working remotely as well. So how do you keep that focus on the customer? Greg Pinn, who's Senior Director at Merlin, is going to talk to us about how finance firms are turning to RegTech to create efficient AML and KYC solutions, key topics when we're thinking about fraud. And Rob Fulcher, who's Strategic Sales Leader for Cube, is going to ask us a pretty important question, I think, around do first generation and legacy RegTech systems present more problems than they solve, which will be an interesting way to round off these presentations. So each presenter's got about 15 minutes or so, and as I told them before you all joined, I will be a hard taskmaster on time. So you'll hear a lovely bell about a minute before they're due to finish. Don't worry, nothing's gone wrong. It's just that I'm giving them a friendly warning. But I'm sure they're all well rehearsed and will keep themselves to time. Just a quick one before we pass across to our first speaker. I was thinking about a bit about this event before we kicked off. My background is wealth management and retail financial services, and I actually grew up in collections and recoveries, dealing with quite vulnerable customers at that time, and speaking to people who were suffering from either kind of serious financial distress or kind of been the victims of some kind of fraud somewhere along the line. And if you read the latest papers from the FCA, you'll be aware that roughly 50% of us can experience being vulnerable at some point in our lives, and for a multitude of different reasons and in a multitude of different ways. And vulnerable customers really can be those first targets of fraud. And if you think about what we're going through right now, but also how that's going to start to really impact our lives as we go through what will likely be a very, very, very large recession and the like. Never has there been more of an opportunity for more people to experience some of those vulnerable events in their lives, but also to become the victims of financial fraud as well. And so hopefully many of the things we're going to talk about today will start to highlight how we can how RegTech can really help our clients and our prospective clients to identify and spot fraud, but also to help manage the implications when that inevitably and unfortunately something has gone wrong. So loads of really good speakers today. As Georgia said, hopefully you'll have lots of questions. I'll be cherry picking out those questions in the Q&A session towards the end. Please drop them in the Q&A as we go along, so that we don't lose any. And I'll be cultivating some of those for the speakers towards the end. We've all got sight of them as you go, so we will be able to kind of make sure you get the best speaker with the best answer. But with no further ado, Sarah, I'm going to hand across to you, if that's okay. You can take us through the changing paradigm and threats from remote working.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Let me just share my screen with everybody. So I hope everybody can see. I'm just putting that into, there we go. Absolutely delighted to be here with you all today. So as Stephen said, I'm a Chief Security Advisor. I actually work across UK financial services. I've been working in the technology and cybersecurity environment for probably about 20 years. I've also got a background in risk and resilience. So really what I want to talk to you about today is just a reflection back on the last sort of 6 months or so, if you can actually believe. It's been 6 months since we've been in lockdown. And just looking at the effects of remote working, some of the issues that have been experienced, and then really just want to touch in on specifically where this has left us from an insider threat perspective and that potential for fraud. And so some of the things that we've been thinking about specifically about how we can help with that. So just to start with, I just want to provide you with some reflections from our CEO, Satya Nadella. And actually, since the world went into lockdown, sort of February, March time, he actually identified that we've seen 2 years worth of digital transformation in 2 months. Most of those have either been current customers who have accelerated digital transformation. Many of those have actually been new customers who have had to really think about how they react to the current situation, how they enable remote working very quickly, and what does that mean? What's that changing paradigm look like? And in particular, the need for sharing and collaboration. And just to really to reflect on one of the things that we've got as Microsoft Teams, we went from 17 million to 75 million active users in several months, and we currently process just over 2.5 billion minutes a day of Teams talks. So just to reflect on some of the things that we've seen, and this is looking back through the market, looking through, talking to customers, and not just in financial services, but actually across all sectors and across all globally. And this is just some of the unexpected challenges that many companies like yourself have seen. So there's been a sudden spike in the need for remote access to applications. You know, many financial services were not set up to work remotely. We've had to see a massive increase in the ability for many users to get access to new devices, bring your own devices, which historically has potentially been a lockdown in financial services, and having to onboard all of those devices and provide applications. One of the biggest issues that we've seen is the exploits of COVID-19 from cyber criminals in particular, and some of the issues with regards to an increase in COVID-19 laws for phishing. And what does that mean? In addition, we've seen issues with VPN vulnerabilities, because a lot of the traffic that we see and financial services are all going against on-prem data centers. And coupled with that is the issues around guarding security and compliance controls, the adjustment of users to actually transitioning and working from home. And as we've seen, how do they collaborate? How do they share information? And that real rush in terms of having to implement changes in governance and their processes. And what does that, all of those things mean? So we've been in a crisis management mode for the last few months. It's all been about availability, getting services as quick up and running as quickly as possible, but potentially that has been at the detriment to some of the security and governance controls that we might have had in place if we weren't in this current situation. So I think it's important, you know, when we talk about insider risk, when we talk about fraud, we really need to look at it from the perspective of what's going on as well with the users. This is a completely an alien environment for many people, not only if they suddenly have to adjust to working remotely, working from home, they've also got to adjust to also school, homeschooling, potentially caring for loved ones. You know, everything's being turned upside down. So really where we want to start with, we want to think about, you know, most users have the best intent in terms of what they're trying to do, how they're trying to do it, how do they adjust to these new ways of working. But obviously that introduces lots of different stressors, and it's those stressors that can potentially lead to either malicious or accidental activity. So when we look at insider risk, one of the things we look at, you know, is we see many customers, many companies, this is one of their top concerns. So cybersecurity in particular has historically always focused on outside in and looking at the external cyber attack as opposed to inside out, which is the threat from within. And within some of the, when we just looked at some of our companies and our customers and how they feel with regards to this threat and where that threat's coming from, now, as you can see from the stats on the page, most companies are kind of 50-50 in terms of where they're worried about that concern coming from, which is this, whether it's malicious or whether it's inadvertent or whether it's accidental. The impact of that, however, is whether it's malicious or accidental, the impact is potentially the same if data has been misused, if it's been leaked, or it's been used for malicious purposes. So one of the things we think about in terms of, you know, we think about, you know, what turns a good person bad potentially if we're looking at a malicious insider. So some of the research that we've done in terms of how much of a risk this is and what things we should be looking for. And we've got kind of 4 key areas that we suggest would be things to look for if we're looking about, you know, how high risk is it that we have from a malicious insider. So first off, we think about a predisposition. So are these individuals, have a history of repeatedly violations? And this could be where they look at where they might have had previous cases of where they have not kept policy or processes. And then we look at the stressor. So actually, is there some kind of event which has triggered some of this activity? I mean, typically you might think about when someone has resigned, whether they've had poor performance at work, maybe they've had disputes, and also when we think about the current situation that we're in right now, obviously the situation of COVID is a massive stressor for many people. And while people are trying to cope with this, actually, for some individuals, this could be the ticking point. If we've got people or family members who've been furloughed, potentially they've got money concerns, they've got financial worries, you can quickly see why all of those things could actually trigger somebody who historically has just been a normal employee to someone who could, under the right conditions, actually be a malicious insider. Then we look at the concerning behaviour. So we're looking at what suddenly, maybe, for example, they're suddenly doing massive downloads of information. They're looking at applications, they're looking at files, they're looking at things that they typically would not be normal for their type of activity. And these are what we would be looking at as flags, potentially for, again, is there a stressor? Is there something which is concerning to us by that individual? And then we look at whether that individual is going out of their way in what we call planning and preparation. So if you think about a user's normal activity, for example, maybe they'll work typically 9 till 5, Monday to Friday. Are they suddenly logging on at the weekend? Are they changing file names? Are they emailing things to themselves? So all of these things combined could be what we might look at as the risk of a malicious insider. So how do we counteract that? Well, actually, this all comes down to how we manage our data. Where is our data? How we're managing the sensitivities of that data, and where is it? So to make sure that data doesn't inadvertently get into the wrong hands, how do we protect it, and how do we make sure that we're compliant to all of our regulatory requirements? And I think this is really, as we can see from the stats, this is one of the key areas of concern about, how do I know who has access to my data? So this all comes down to information protection and governance. And this is really about understanding your data landscape, where those sensitivities in the data are. So know your data, govern your data, and more importantly, protect your data. And this is really where I want to talk about some of the principles about data loss prevention, particularly when we think about insider threat, and particularly when we think about how some of our users are sharing and collaborating with users at the moment. So let's think about, why DLP, why data loss prevention? Well, we think about it, it's the impacting of data leakages, in terms of where we've got high impact potential for regulatory fines. But it's also making sure that we're giving users the right information, the right guidance, and the right enforcement to make sure they're acting in the right way. And as we sort of said, not everything is malicious. Sometimes this comes down to people making mistakes, not understanding changes in policies and requirements, and how certain data should be treated in this current environment. And it's really looking about those sensitivities. So first and foremost, before we even think about DLP, we have to think about how we classify that data. Now, really, obviously, I'm talking from Microsoft perspective, and with assuming the vast majority of people who are on the call are using Microsoft Office, Microsoft 365 in one way. And actually part of the compliance that is built in to Office 365 is the ability to actually classify that data. So if it's medical data, financial data, also nuances with regards to different social security numbers, so knowing the difference between UK, Australia, Germany, for example. And I just want to talk about how that's reflected. So how does DLP work when we're thinking about matching patterns of data? So just very quickly, we think about a 16-digit number with a Visa card. We would look for checksums. We would look at how do we know the difference between that being a credit card number versus actually being a harmless 16-digit string, or for example, it could be just a number that could be used by a serial number, help desk number, etc. So actually DLP is intelligent enough to be able to decipher the difference between a normal 16-digit number and a credit card number. And that's really how that DLP works in terms of that differentiator. But of course, that DLP actually needs to be trained. It actually needs to know the difference between something which is positive versus a false positive. And those DLPs policies need to be enforced right the way across. So historically, people might have thought around DLP as around email protection, but actually it works across all platforms. So it can work against SharePoint, it can work about Exchange, and any of those Office applications. But one of the things I'm going to focus on specifically is around Microsoft Teams. So why do we do this? What we're trying to do is we're not just trying to catch people out, we're trying to balance protection. We're trying to stop that violation before it happens, before the data disappears out of your business and before you're trying to deal with the consequences. But additionally, we're trying to balance that productivity with security. We want people to be able to go about their normal business, but we want to make sure they're doing it in the right way. And where they're potentially violating any of those policies, that they're actually, we're enforcing that action and we're providing them with guidance about what they should be doing. So just as an example here, so hopefully you can read this. So if we look at, again, that use of Microsoft Teams, a new capability that we've actually introduced is regarding how we could actually identify and block the use of personal data, medical data, and that kind of thing in Teams channels or chats. So actually, if you can see in this example, if somebody tried to actually, even this is quite innocent, actually try to share credit card information, it would be blocked. But in addition to that, the user would actually receive an in-app policy tip and guidance as to why it's being blocked and what they should do about it. So I just want to kind of to end with, just to give you experience from the end user's perspective. So we're talking about financial data, but also we've got insurers who might be looking at medical data, life insurance policies, critical illness. You might have underwriters who are sharing information perfectly legitimately, but again, so in this example, Megan sends a message to Alan and it's containing sensitive information regarding medical information. This information actually gets blocked by DLP because it identifies that it's blocks the information, it's sensitive data and it can't be shared. So Megan can actually see that reason why it's being blocked is because it actually infringes different policies and it gives them options. And this is really up to you about, could that be overridden or can that be reported to admin as a mistake? So it's really part of that sort of the management and policy control is it automatically blocked? Does it alerts get written if somebody tries to do that? And then thinking about it in terms of then from the other person's perspective, what Alan sees from Megan is actually that Megan has sent him a message, but it's been blocked. So both individuals see that has been blocked. So just to end with, in terms of how you would start. So really, when we're thinking about how to share data, how to collaborate with that data and how to use it to both effect. So it's really about understanding the data landscape, those sensitivities, and we would recommend incrementally turning on some of these DLP enforcement actions, starting with a small group and working from there. And then just being able to expand across that to your business to make sure that you can get to the full effect. And that's where I'd like to end. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Sarah. And well done on handling the intrusive bell. Well done. Very, very impressed. I sympathise hugely with the challenges, by the way, in there around getting some of those data points right, particularly when they're long form numbers like those credit cards. Really good. Amazing. Right. So I think we're coming to Joe Norburn, CEO of RecordSure next, to talk to us about ensuring or how we ensure good customer outcomes and manage risk whilst working remotely as well. So Joe, over to you.
Thanks, Steve. Just bear with me. I will share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. That's great. Okay, so really excited to talk to you all today. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world today. Stephen and I work together, so hands up, just so that people know that. It was interesting to hear that we had 15 minutes because he told me I had 10. I'm notoriously one for running over. So Steve, thank you for managing my expectations. Okay, onwards. So my name's Joe Norburn. I'm the CEO of RecordSure. I've been here about 18 months or so. I spent most of my career in and around financial services, either in banks of one sort or another, dealing with smaller companies like RecordSure, or in companies like RecordSure selling into bigger banks and other organisations. Now, we are clearly not as well known as Microsoft, so Sarah didn't really need to explain who Microsoft is. Everybody knows, household name. RecordSure not quite yet in that same bracket. So let me just talk to you a little bit about who we are and what we do. So RecordSure was founded in 2012. We bring what we'd like to say is intelligent insight and action into customer conversations. We're RegTech really to our very core, to our DNA, and we believe that we've got the language of financial services and how to make sense of what has been said between a bank and its customer, or a bank and its clients. We help firms really understand their interactions, and we do so against the backdrop of compliance and risk management to improve the outcomes that banks are seeking to drive, and do so at scale. We use AI, of course, we do, and we really enable firms to identify how well processes are being followed. You know, we flag risks to the business to help support compliant outcomes, really without trying to interrupt the flow that happens between a bank and their customer. Our ways of capturing that data allows organisations to move on from what really is now an outdated and no longer fit for purpose method of using sampling, often in single digits, to truly understand what is going on in terms of the interactions between themselves and their customers. We allow that to happen on a risk-based approach, and that drives insight and automation, and importantly, that insight really is about driving the right sorts of interventions between the bank and its customers to deliver ultimately great service and keep those customers safe. None of that happens without people, and so I'll touch on the people element. It's not all about technology. I'm a former head of digital at a couple of organisations, one of which is a leading UK private bank. And people often were surprised when I talked about the importance of people being ahead of digital. So we don't really look to replace the human in all instances. It's really about teaming great technology with some great people and driving the sorts of outcomes that banks are looking to do. We're talking about RegTech, and we are RegTech, of course we are. And so often we're talking about adherence to processes and regulation, but the same technology can also be used to drive greater customer service, improve training and competence, and ultimately revenue as well. We work with a number of the UK leading banks, and also we're doing increasingly the same thing in Australia, and we're also used by the UK government. But the topic of the talk today is really about ensuring good customer outcomes when managing risk when you're working remotely, and of course that's all been driven by the pandemic that we are all currently in. Now those changes and challenges are well known to us all, but it's worth remembering. And Sarah said, gave some remarkable stats a few minutes ago in terms of how much has changed in such a short space of time. Unsurprisingly, it looks like we're talking about some of the same sorts of things as well. So there's been a huge technology sort of transformation. The comment from Satya about 2 years of innovation and digital transformation in 2 months is being felt everywhere. I think that's absolutely true. And that really is exacerbating some of the challenges that people are experiencing in either sort of dealing with their banks and their financial services institutions, or the organisations themselves seeking to deliver great service to their customers and clients. We're all working remotely. Actually, bizarrely, I'm in the office today, and it's nice to be in an air-conditioned environment, let me tell you. But remote working really does make trying to stay connected, truly connected, and keep that team dynamic going in a way that is effective. It does make it much more difficult, and so that's been exacerbated clearly by the current pandemic. We have seen really an unprecedented number of inbound inquiries, and that's either been inquiries into organisations on the back of the COVID pandemic, people wanting to change, for example, their repayments on mortgages, but it's also meant that those inquiries have gone through channels that are now fit to bursting in many ways. One of the banks I used to work for was NatWest Group, and Alison Rose, who's the chief executive there, was quoted back in April, I believe it was, saying that the call centres normally take 3,000 calls a day, and at that point in time they were receiving 25,000. So, you know, an 8-fold increase in calls coming in that have to be dealt with, and dealt with well, and dealt with in a way that's not, you know, opening up further risks to fraud or non-adherence to key processes. So big increases there. And to deal with that volume, what is then also happening, and some of us may have experienced this firsthand, is that we're being asked to help out in different areas. And often that comes with a lack of familiarity, that comes with some upskilling and some training. But all of that has meant it's been quite a curious environment in a very short space of time. It really has been an unparalleled disruption across all industries. And inevitably, again, as Sarah was saying, in periods of uncertainty, you see some opportunities for bad actors, be they internally or externally, to seek to make the most of that opportunity and perpetrate sort of fraud and other things that we need to protect against. So if I take a quick look at each of those briefly, being mindful of Steve's daughter's bicycle bell and not wanting to be timed out. So the technology decisions have happened in very short order. We've seen our clients implement changes very rapidly, and in the main done so very well. But we've got really new channels and new ways of working between customers and those organisations. That increases the risk, and you know, where there is that risk, there is the opportunity for fraud, be it man in the middle through increased volume or whatever it's going to be. We've also seen, I think in a number of instances, some technology beyond our customer base, I'll hasten to add, where decisions have been made very quickly and things have been implemented in very short order, and not all of the security considerations have been taken into account. And people will need to retrofit you know, good security practices against that, but do so very quickly, so that the safety net that had previously existed in the normal as it was is absolutely in place for what has become the new norm. From a team standpoint, I mentioned a second ago, it's really about different muscle memory. Gone now, currently, until people are getting back to some form of hybrid model, are the almost subconscious and invisible benefits of working side by side. We don't have the opportunity to overhear what a colleague is talking about on the telephone. You don't have the opportunity to hear that curious call that's come in, and the opportunity to talk to somebody about it in the moment, because we're not side by side anymore. So we do need to find different ways of being able to tap into staying connected whilst we're not all physically present together. The higher volumes are also meaning, beyond that kind of different behavioural way of working and the different muscle memory, is that the sampling approach to delivering good quality control and quality assurance to the practices, many of which are aimed at sort of combating the risk of fraud, have to be dependent on sampling, unless people have different forms of technology as exist in the RegTech community. But with the increased volume of interactions, even if you're able to keep your sample at the same percentage, again typically single digit percentages, the absolute number of what's not being looked at is just going up and up and up, and so your risk clearly is then also increasing. And then as people are getting up to speed with new roles, so opens up the opportunity for that lack of experience to be exploited by those bad actors. So at the end of the day, what I think that then really means is that we're seeing an increased risk of fraud, both to consumers and to organisation. There's greater potential for more mis-selling. We've all seen that in the bad old days, and that mis-selling could be deliberate in terms of the opportunity being exploited, or unintentional because people are not so familiar with those processes and practices. Ultimately, what that then leads to is poor customer experience. And that poor customer experience clearly has a knock-on to brand loyalty, has a knock-on to reputational considerations, and it may mean that you see a customer churn that's in higher numbers than before, and clearly then reduced revenues. So there are some gaps to be closed, and as we look at it from a point of view in terms of the space where RecordSure plays, the problems are there on the left-hand side. So conversations are not always now being recorded. As people have moved to those new channels, those channels aren't necessarily being recorded. Even if you are then recording the conversations, just focusing on the recordings full stop can actually introduce new challenges. I've had some conversations with some organisations who maybe have heads in buckets of sand, who say, well, the more that we record, the greater things that we know, the more the regulator would expect us to step up to it. Absolutely, and I'm firmly of that opinion. But you can't go around not knowing what's going on within your organisation. So it's really important to make sure that you're recording. But not just recording, then really looking into the payload of those conversations that are happening between an organisation and its customer base. But each of those are challenges. So conversations going unrecorded, we are currently working with Microsoft to build in the capability to make sure that anything happens over Microsoft Teams is recorded and recorded well, and then has the capability of having the RecordSure smarts, machine learning, apply the analytics and the insight and the intelligence into what actually was said within those conversations. So capturing those conversations is possible, and possible on the new channels that the world has moved to. Once you've got all those recordings, you can use technology from organisations like us and others to really break down that conversation into different themes and lenses to ensure that you know what was being discussed, and without having to do that by being physically present in the room as people had been historically, or having an extra party join a call, or more challenging, having a supervisor join a video call, as some organisations are doing, which just delivers quite a curious client experience. So I've said that I think sample checking is dead and outdated, and is actually a dangerous thing to be reliant upon. But you now can use these technologies to truly start automating the process and combining it with people, because ultimately it's people who make things happen and are important still in the mix going forward. So you do need to have good technology, but you do need smart people too. Oh, a minute left. And if we ever thought about needing smart people and smart technology, you can ask Gavin Williamson and Ofqual. For those of you who are in the UK, you'll get the gist of what I'm talking about there. But minimising fraud risk and working efficiently within an organisation, delivering great customer outcomes and service is made easier when one is working compliantly with good processes. And we can think of the word compliance or compliantly with a small c or a capital C, small c in terms of process adherence, or a capital C within the realms of adhering to regulation. But whichever the latter, compliance starts with performance, conduct and culture. And technology solutions like ours help supervisors monitor advisors unobtrusively and accurately, and help to sort of perpetuate best practice. These sorts of technologies, when used well, allow advisors to get a better level of support, a better level of insight in terms of what they're doing well and what they're not doing well, and where they need to focus. But ultimately, it's all about the customer and making sure that you're driving good customer outcomes whilst doing it safely within an organisation. And if you do combine all those things together, of course, happy customers who are getting great service and value what you offer are going to do more business with you. So in terms of the summary, you know, there aren't sort of generally new issues. COVID has really just kicked some of the old ones much more into the spotlight. You know, the challenges haven't changed, but things around us are. You know, the risk of not adhering to processes does increase the risks of fraud and poor customer outcomes, as I've discussed. Recording is great, but do something more with it. And it's really easy to talk about that, but fundamentally, the thing that I'd like people to take away is that whilst these challenges might seem quite daunting, the technology and the processes and the best practices do exist today. So addressing and stepping up to these challenges and managing client relationships remotely is entirely possible. And with that, Steve, that's probably the first time I've ever finished on time for you. So you're very welcome, and I will hand back to you.
Thank you, Joe. I'll point out that you didn't quite finish on time, but nice try. Very good. Okay, thank you for that. And some questions started to come through, so thank you to those who are sending through some questions. Please do keep them coming in. They will help see that Q&A towards the end. So without further ado, Greg Pinn, I'm going to hand over to you, Senior Director of Merlin. So talk to us about how finance firms are turning to RegTech to create efficient AML and KYC solutions. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Joe and Sarah. This has been very, very interesting. I'm going to switch the topic a little bit from what's been discussed previously on internal controls and managing those internal processes to speak more on how financial institutions and regulated businesses need to look at AML and KYC solutions and drive forward innovation in these spaces to meet the needs of both the existing processes and existing issues, as well as driving additional functionality, additional needs as required by COVID. As George has said before, and I think it was said by Sarah as well, in any pandemic or natural disaster, terrorist attack, any sort of situation like this, we see the most vulnerable members of society being the ones that are impacted most by financial crime. Whether this is the huge increase we've seen recently in elder fraud, we've seen in the US, we've seen a lot of fraud related to the Payroll Protection Plan and the CARES Act, as well as just a lot of frauds against people who are desperate. And this has become a much, much greater problem with COVID because this is a global phenomenon. Unlike the normal situation that we're used to seeing with crimes, natural disasters and other sort of localized events, the global nature of COVID has really opened up a huge amount of fraud against individuals and entities globally, in addition to the normal financial crime that we see every day. And so the question is, how do financial institutions and compliance departments, along with their anti-money laundering and know your customer divisions, answer these growing needs? And where we are, it's a very interesting time, because COVID came at sort of a time of inflection with the regulatory compliance space as it was. So if you look at the slide here, you can see really looking at the last 40 or so years of RegTech, of anti-money laundering and know your customer RegTech. What we saw in the 80s and really much more in the 90s and early 2000s was the first generation, what I call AML 1.0. AML 1.0 are those companies that many financial institutions use today. From a data perspective, you've got players like WorldCheck, RDC, World Compliance, Dow Jones Factiva and Dow Jones Risk and Compliance. From software, you've got Fiserv, EastNet, Fircosoft, Acuity, Complinet, and then all of the different services around that as well. And we saw from that period of the mid-80s to the early 2000s, the creation of the initial products, the initial software solutions that were there to ensure that financial institutions could comply with things like the USA Bank Secrecy Act and other early AML and KYC compliance requirements. In 2001, everything obviously changed with the 9/11 attacks and the passage of the USA Patriot Act, along with the passage of the first EU money laundering directive. We saw a big shift in the requirements for compliance. Early on, if you look back, and for those of you that have been in compliance 15, 20 years, as I have, in these early days, we were seeing fines in the low millions. I remember, 15 years ago, a $5-6 million fine was considered huge. We're now seeing fines in the billions of dollars. And so a lot of the software that exists today was to prevent institutions from reputational damage and to just show the regulators that they were doing enough. We've switched. That has been changed significantly in the last 10 years with the huge growth in fines, with the huge amount that we're seeing of the change in the way that both financial institutions and regulators look at AML and KYC compliance. This has necessitated a revolution in technology. The sort of difficult part of this is, for any of you that work for financial institutions or fintechs, the pace of innovation for those companies is obviously very slow. And so we've seen a lot of great innovation on the vendor side and not nearly as much acquisition of that innovation on the financial institution side. One of the things that, I guess, the silver lining to the horrible pandemic of COVID is that this has pushed a lot of compliance departments and made it so that they aggressively need to start looking at these technologies. Compliance is one of those functions of a financial institution that has always been done in person. And a lot of the tools that were available were in-person legacy tools that required connection to a local network, required users to be sitting in front of computers at offices. In 2020, obviously that's not possible. And so we've seen a huge shift, a very quick, immediate shift that compliance companies have had to take to start bringing in these new technologies, whether that's for screening, identity management, or some of the adverse media, which is what my business Merlon does, as well as newer challenges, such as ultimate beneficial ownership, as well as blockchain. So if you look at sort of the history and the span of where we are in the RegTech revolution, you see a lot of institutions solving both very old challenges all the way to new challenges on the right. Some of these old challenges are things like ID verification. So this is the creation of the artificial intelligence and imaging technologies that have allowed companies like Jumio, Trulio, and Onfido to create ID verification tools that don't require in-person verification, that don't rely on a person making a decision. We've seen companies like Karan looking at how sanctions compliance can be turned on its head. We've seen Beam and Comply Advantage looking at screening technologies. Merlon, Merlon.ai, my business, focused on how you can change the way you look at adverse media. How can you look at the enormous world of negative news, the billions upon billions of articles that are published globally, and make sense of what is risk and what is not. In the case of adverse media, we've seen an 8-fold increase in the last 20 years in the amount of content being made available, while so many financial institutions are relying on technologies from 20 years ago that simply cannot scale. The increase in the ability for vendors, for RegTech firms, to create sophisticated natural language processing and true AI solutions is changing the way that banks can look at how they do these tasks like adverse media screening. Continuing on, you have firms like Neotos looking at enhanced due diligence reporting using AI and automating some of those tasks. And then you move on to some of the newest challenges. Ultimate beneficial ownership. Historically, UBO was really done by legacy vendors, done in Bradstreet, Bureau Van Dyke, and we've seen some new RegTech startups looking at how can you go further and deeper. These are businesses like Sayari Labs. You have cannabis and marijuana-related businesses and how financial institutions are able to track those. And then you've got some of the newest challenges around blockchain. So how can institutions take a much more risk-based approach to working with virtual asset service providers, blockchain exchanges, and other blockchain firms, so that instead of considering all cryptocurrency transactions high risk, really take a balanced approach. And these are vendors like Chainalysis, Elliptic, Blockchain Intelligence Group, TRM Labs, a variety of different players in the market. And so if we go back to the previous slide, we can see how a lot of these companies I've mentioned are really changing the way that challenger banks and fintechs are able to meet these requirements, both the new requirements that exist today in the market, as well as these historical requirements, and being able to do them in a much more efficient way. If we take a look now at that sort of from the vendor perspective, if we now look at this from the regulatory perspective, what we've seen globally is a huge, huge push by regulators for financial institutions and fintechs to embrace RegTech technology. This is a case where a lot of financial institutions have a very nervous approach to this. You know, our regulator knows what we use, they're happy enough with it, we don't want to rock the boat. And what the regulators are coming out and saying is, this is an area where in order to stay compliant, you have to innovate. In the same way that a financial institution, if we go back to Microsoft at the beginning of our talk, a financial institution would be, it would be improper and not safe for them to be using Windows 95 or Windows 98. Their compliance team should not be using software from 15, 20, 25 years ago. The big challenge there is that the risks and the requirements are changing, and the technology used by financial criminals is growing and becoming more sophisticated. And so if you're using the same tools to fight the crime that you were using before and the crimes are growing, you're a step behind. One of the very, very interesting things about being in AML and KYC compliance is it's one of the few areas outside of law enforcement or NGOs where you're truly able to do good. We are, as compliance professionals, on the front line of stopping some of the worst crimes in the world. Human trafficking, sexual exploitation of women and children, wildlife crime, environmental crime, as well as fraud and terrorist financing, and all of the other crimes that are associated. In order for us to do that properly as professionals, we need to take a much more mature look at the technology we use to do that. And so one of the silver lining of this horrible pandemic has been forcing financial institutions to look at what are the technologies that they can bring in to make their teams more effective and to be able to mitigate more risk. It's, you know, like I said before about the fines, not only are we seeing greater fines, we're seeing significantly greater reputational damage as well. You only have to look at banks like HSBC, Deutsche Bank, Danske Bank, Swedbank, Westpac. The list goes on and on of these banks that have been headline news for AML deficiencies. And this is cases where old, outdated processes that lack both the AML controls as well as the controls that Sarah and Joe were speaking of earlier, all of those come together in how these need to be mitigated. When we look at sort of the investment and the growth in the RegTech market, over the last 5 to 7 years, we've seen huge amounts of investment in RegTech providers, growing some really, really innovative solutions. At the same time, we've seen a pretty steady or constantly rising increase in the global KYC and AML fines. One thing missing from this graph, because it would have completely blown up the graph, is the almost $9 billion fine in 2015 against BNP Paribas, one of the largest fines ever for AML and KYC fines. And so both that is not a cost of doing business sort of fine, that is bringing a bank to its knees. We've seen similar fines against HSBC and Deutsche Bank as well. Likely we're going to see it with Swedbank and Danske Bank as well as Westpac. You know, the initial reports with Westpac was that the fines could be in the trillions of dollars. Obviously that's not reasonable, but this is what the pressure that's on compliance individuals. One of the things that's so critical to compliance professionals, compliance management, is keeping costs down. Unfortunately, where that balance seems to lie is either getting non-purpose-built tools for free or using very cheap purpose-built tools in exchange for looking at what is your total cost of ownership. We've done an analysis here at Merlon looking at sort of the most extreme case of this. In research that was recently published, 85% of financial institutions use Google News for some part of their compliance. 85%. The reason for that is that Google News is free. The problem with that is that it's not really free. The cost of lost efficiency in using a tool like Google News for adverse media screening is enormous. In our experiments, we've seen a 90% reduction in the amount of time it takes to do a case using an advanced tool like Merlon versus what can be done in Google News, simply because of modern NLP, natural language processing, and AI-driven technologies, rather than using non-purpose-built or older technologies. And when it comes down to it, the amount saved per analyst is upwards of $18,000 a year. And so if you look at a team with 10 analysts, obviously it's $180,000 a year. If you're a medium to large financial institution, you're talking close to $250,000 a year in lost costs, in lost spend, simply because the perception of free was driving your approach. So to sort of close off and to sort of bring this all back to the start, we as compliance professionals, whether it's in data loss prevention, whether it's in record maintenance, or AML and KYC, our obligation is both to protect our businesses, but also as a front line of law enforcement and a front line of stopping these frauds and financial crimes and the most susceptible amongst us. So with that, thank you very much. I was hoping to get the bell. So I'll pass it back to you, and thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you, Greg. The only person so far today who wanted to hear the bell. Well done. Thank you for that. Hugely insightful stuff there, and loads of questions for you when we get to the Q&A. Do keep those questions coming in, guys. We've got some really good ones that have come through and have made it to being published so far. So please do keep some of those good questions coming in. I will now hand over to Rob Fulcher, Strategic Sales Lead for Cube, to ask us, do first generation and legacy RegTech platforms present more problems than they solve, which is a really nice follow on. So over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Steve. Let me first of all check, Steve, maybe you can confirm, can you see my slides?
Yeah, you're there, and thankfully I'm not, for those who are watching as well. So you're good to go.
Okay, good. Thank you, and thank you, Greg. There's a lot that you just shared there that resonates with me and kind of plays nicely into what I'm about to discuss. Sarah, something that you mentioned earlier that resonates with me as well is the homeschooling and our world's being turned upside down. That's definitely something that resonates in this household at the moment. But thank you very much. So I guess good afternoon and good morning, perhaps, for some of the people that have tuned into this. As Steve mentioned, my name is Rob Fulcher. I've spent the last 20 years or so within the compliance and risk space with a key focus on GRC, governance, risk and compliance, and more recently and specifically regulatory intelligence and regulatory change. Prior to Cube, I spent about 15 years at Thomson Reuters. In fact, Greg, I saw you had Complanet on your timeline, so I had a few years at Complanet before that was acquired by Thomson Reuters. But in 2018, I started to look for the next business or the next technology that could help elevate compliance organisations to a more automated and efficient manner of managing regulatory change and regulatory monitoring. And that's when I stumbled across Cube. So for those who aren't familiar with Cube, Cube is a dynamic RegTech that specialises in converting regulatory content into regulatory intelligence and relieving that kind of that burden, that headache of regulatory monitoring, mapping and change. As Steve mentioned, I'm here to talk about the challenges related to first generation solutions and how those challenges are kind of being addressed by RegTechs in the market at the moment. But first, I just thought I would set just a little bit of context before we move on to the slides and the pitfalls of those modern solutions. So first of all, past, present and future climate. I think without kind of labouring the point, everyone appreciates that post 2008, the financial crash, an awful lot changed for compliance. All of a sudden we saw an enormous amount of regulatory change coming through, and increased scrutiny from firms, regulators, and obviously increased fines as well. So as a result, financial services firms reacted. They invested hugely within compliance, resources, personnel, budget and spend. And I think that aligned well to the increased workload, of course. And without going through that timeline from 2008 to today, in recent years, I think what we're actually seeing is a scaling back in terms of personnel and some of the investment, or at least expectation around scaling back. And that is in spite of regulatory change. I'm based over here in the US, so regardless of current administration, but regulatory change still remains very, very high. At Cube, we monitor over 50,000 regulatory change pieces, both pending and proposed, as well as effective changes. Also, those fines, as Greg just mentioned as well, fines remain at an all-time high as well. So in short, compliance is being asked to do more for less, with less available to them, which obviously opens the door to RegTechs to come in and help them address that particular problem. And also, if we just look at the current climate, again, what this pandemic has brought about, what we've seen at Cube and what we expect to continue to see is a heightened focus and attention from the regulators on some of these topics that Sarah mentioned as well, that have come about as a result of what this new working environment where everyone's working more remotely. So topics like financial crime and cyber and privacy and business continuity. So new regulations coming through there. Secondly, what do I mean by legacy or first generation solutions? Well, I absolutely mean pre-RegTech. So solutions that aren't currently deploying artificial intelligence, machine learning, natural language processing to help improve accuracy and efficiency across reg monitoring and reg change. And a lot of these solutions, these first generation solutions, would have existed pre-financial crash, actually, such as legacy GRCs, and they simply weren't designed in anticipation of the volume and velocity of regulatory change that we've seen over the last 12 years. So that brings about its own challenges. So they're the types of solutions, without obviously naming any names, that I'm referring to when I'm referring to traditional legacy or first generation solutions. And lastly, a notable mention, if this was a couple of years ago, I may have included this in the following slides, which is that kind of manual approach to regulatory change and regulatory monitoring. But I think we're actually at a point in time, and hopefully my friends on this call would agree with me, that that practitioners and regulators are kind of coming together in agreement now that that old approach of throwing people and at the problem and trying to manage, in this instance, in Cube's instance, regulatory change through a collection of different spreadsheets, that's no longer seen as a solution. Certainly not a long-term sustainable solution either. Okay, so moving on. So this is what I'm calling the pitfalls of legacy solutions in today's climate, and starting with regulatory gaps. What I mean by regulatory gaps, so legacy content providers and solutions, they've rarely been able to present or evidence a fully comprehensive global inventory of regulations. And that means in turn, of course, that firms are left with holes or gaps in the inventories which they are taking from those legacy providers, which of course in turn leaves them very exposed to their regulators. And actually at Cube, we're seeing a trend across the globe, very much so in North America, but certainly across the globe, where the key financial services regulators are asking firms to evidence that they have a full understanding of the complete regulatory obligations across their businesses. And what I mean by that is, can they evidence to them a complete and comprehensive inventory of all applicable laws and regulations that apply to their businesses? So that's an awful lot to do if you're a tier 1 global bank operating in a number of different jurisdictions. And the traditional approach to trying to solve that with these legacy solutions is sometimes to go out and try and plug the gaps through multiple different solution providers, or to go out to law firms or to again throw people at the problem. But all of those approaches bring about inconsistencies in data, as well as uncertainty of completeness, and of course all with great expense. The second pitfall is data errors. And as I mentioned earlier, most first generation solutions weren't designed to manage the complexity of post-financial crash regulations. And traditional content providers, because of aging technologies, they've been unable to convert regulatory content that you can access via a regulated website or the web. They've been unable to convert that into regulatory intelligence. So the result is a lot of erroneous or frequently duplicated data that appears in firms' first-gen reg change solutions. And of course, that's a problem. But I'd say the biggest problem and the biggest challenge in legacy solutions, as far as data is concerned, is overwhelming compliance and business and policy and control owners within the business with data that just isn't delivered at a right level of granularity. It's delivered at too high a level. So this actually means that a first generation solution is it's actually counterproductive for the very purpose it was brought into to serve. It actually means that compliance and business owners are actually sifting through a lot of unnecessary noise in order to determine applicability. Outsource mapping, again, just looking at the space that Cube plays in, which is regulatory change management, regulatory intelligence. This is probably one of the most overlooked aspects of a delivery of such a solution, and it's the activity of mapping regulations to a firm's internal structure or internal risk taxonomies or policies or controls. That's when we look at the traditional sense, when we look at those legacy solutions, that's a very time consuming and labor intensive exercise. And so very often it's outsourced to firms, be they legal firms or consulting firms, to undertake those activities, which obviously comes at a huge cost to the business. Next is poor interoperability. Again, first gen GRC platforms were historically designed to cater for general governance, risk and compliance functions, as opposed to specifically understanding the complex requirements of regulatory change. So as a result, data's often not leveraged in an efficient way across the organization. And that means that whether it's intended or not, of course, it's largely not intended, but it creates fragmentation across groups within an organization, and ultimately it duplicates efforts, whether that's obtaining content or dissecting content in a way that's relevant to any one group and the articles that they own. Last, I say last. There's many I can list, but I've gone with the top 5 here, which is efficient and costly. Sorry, inefficient and costly, because of some of the reasons which I've stated above here, with the regulatory gaps, data errors, etc. There's often a very kind of poor user experience on the first generation solutions. We deal with this all the time when we're talking with our customers, that these solutions are often deployed at an enterprise level, but it doesn't have the uptake. It hasn't been embraced at a true enterprise level. And very, very often, again, it means that these firms end up cobbling together different solutions to try and cater for different areas that aren't using a solution at an enterprise level, creating a lot of inefficiencies and obviously a lot of cost that comes along with it. So moving across to addressing those pitfalls with RegTech solutions. If I look first of all at regulatory gaps, and I do obviously have a focus here on Q, but I'll try and keep this more generically within this space. But in 2020, in fact, this has been the case really since 2015, RegTechs now have the ability to deploy AI, machine learning, natural language processing, and spidering technologies as well to capture a much wider spectrum of financial services regulation, but do it much faster as well, and ultimately get to the point that they have a fully comprehensive global inventory of content and can in turn deliver a global inventory of relevant content to their customers. At Cube, we currently monitor over 2,000 issuing bodies. I mentioned earlier that on average we're looking at over 50,000 different regulatory changes that come out of those 2,000 issuing bodies. But within those bodies, we've got some 10 million plus individual regulatory statements, and that spans over 180 different countries and 60 different languages. So it ensures that we've got watertight tracking of regulations, and this just wouldn't have been possible before the dawn of RegTech and that ability to kind of go much broader, much faster. Next, looking at data errors, if we look at tailored, relevant results, again, because of these modern technologies that RegTech are able to deploy, we've got an ability to deliver regulatory content in a much more meaningful and accurate and structured way. So at Cube, as an example, we automatically deconstruct and classify all regulatory content that we're ingesting, and that's coming in from a variety of different sources. So we're normalizing it, deconstructing it, and classifying it so that we can deliver relevant materials to our clients at a level of granularity that improves efficiencies and drastically reduces room for error. Was that the bell I just heard, Steve?
It was, Rob, yeah.
All right, okay. Outsourced mapping, so automated mapping. For me, this is probably the biggest item that any one firm can think about when they're looking at deploying a reg change solution, because the expense of going out to services firms to help with this mapping is so significant. With RegTech, they're actually able to automate the process by aligning the classified content that they have with a firm's internal taxonomies. Cube has some differentiators in this space which can drastically save time and effort, and, as I say, automate that process. Poor interoperability, this is a must as well in today's world. Having an open API that allows the data to freely, securely, but freely and seamlessly move from a reg change solution into the rest of the organization so that data can be used across that organization. So fragmentation goes, and you're actually able to get the most value out of data as you look at business owners, etc. And lastly, Steve, I'll keep this one short. Efficient and costly. So the answer to that is automated and efficient. And hopefully from what I've shared, and actually what my friends prior to this have shared on their presentations, it should be kind of fairly obvious that with RegTech, we're greatly able to improve the previous kind of inefficiencies that those first generation legacy solutions brought about by introducing a much more automated, much more efficient way of working across an organization, which of course in turn improves those operational and commercial efficiencies. And Steve, with that, I will hand back across to you.
Thank you, Rob. A close run thing for who's going to hit their timings. I think it's fair to say Greg and Sarah get the virtual award for hitting their marks. Well done. And I'll share with you after who didn't or by how much, but I'll keep that between us. Thank you so much to everybody who's presented. Some really great presentations in there, and some really important points for us all to kind of consider, and it's really great to see some of the questions that have been coming through, and I've been kind of preparing some for some of you as well. You'll be delighted to know. I'm going to turn to some of the questions that are in the chat. What I would say is if I'll pick on people to come and maybe offer an opinion, and then others can chime in, but if you do have a view from the panel on any of the particular questions in the chat, then do feel free to reply to them and kind of add in those questions directly. But I'll start picking through a couple now. So I'm going to start from the middle. Why not? So, to what extent do regulators endorse or expect solutions like the ones that you guys are working to? And I'm going to turn to Greg actually first, if I may, to kind of what extent do you think regulators are endorsing, expecting the kinds of solutions we're seeing?
So I'll say that none of the regulators endorse a specific solution. They're all very, very clear that they don't have a preference on specific vendors. But I will say that overwhelmingly, when we talk to regulators, and I'll say for Merlon, we've spoken to probably half a dozen to a dozen regulators globally, and they are always keen to understand what's in the market, because for them to understand what's being provided from a RegTech perspective helps them to drive enforcement at the financial institutions. So they can then go back and say, your processes aren't sufficient, and we know that there are vendors that can do it better. The notices from FinCEN, from the FCA, from regulators around the world in the last 12 to 24 months have really been pushing the approach that financial institutions have to innovate. They have to look at RegTech. They have to look at how they can solve these problems in new ways. And what they recommend usually is try it out. Run some tests, run some experiments, do your due diligence. Don't just grab anything you find off the street. Make sure you kick the tires and see if it works for you. But there's no excuse not to be trying.
I guess open to the rest of the panel. Anybody want to add to the points Greg was making?
Yeah, this is Rob. I would second that, Greg. I think if that question was raised 4 or 5 years ago, we were at a more kind of skeptical stage as far as RegTechs and what they can do with AI, but we're definitely at that. We've kind of transitioned in the last few years. We're definitely at the point now where regulators are actually considering how they deliver their content in order for it to be more ingestible and easier to deliver via RegTechs and easier to be machine read. And personally at Cube, Greg, I agree with you, can't be endorsed by any one regulator, but regulators are aware that what we are doing for our customers, and whilst there won't be any kind of big press release about it, but they welcome what RegTechs are bringing to this space and how rapidly they can deliver.
And I completely agree with what the guys have just said. One of the things which I think is obvious but worth saying is that the regulators are trying to do a good job, right? So they're trying to drive good customer outcomes, and I think there is a huge recognition that you can't do that based on practices of the past, and therefore technology is absolutely key in terms of opening up capacity, consistency, scalability, because it's all about driving good conduct and good customer outcomes, and you have to do that through technology, and RegTech is obviously where that comes through.
So I wonder if we come to you next with a question actually. So one of the ones that came through was have firms been quick to adopt technologies? And the things we were talking about at the time was very much about recording technologies, but also about those kind of social sharing tools, Teams being the one that we're all on and Teams being the one that is most prevalent. So have you seen firms being really quick to adopt these technologies during the pandemic, and has this caused kind of disruption, do you think?
Yeah, I'd say it's a bit of both, Steve, actually. So quick to adopt, but also hesitant, I think. So I think what we've seen is that need to share and collaborate is really, really critical. And not just in terms of making sure that we're working together proactively and everything else, but just that regular check-in and cadence, between teams and individuals, and making sure that we're doing the right thing. I think what we've seen is not just looking at Teams, but we've seen lots of different platforms that are suddenly being used for sharing and collaboration. What I would probably say is they've got different levels of security and productivity, and that's really brought that to the forefront. Is we need to share, we need to collaborate, but we need to do it safely and securely and in the right way. And in many respects, that's what's driven us to actually come up with these different solutions. So we obviously talk to different customers, not just in financial services, but across multiple sectors across the globe. And what we do is obviously we take on board all of those things. And what we look at is where can we deliver the best services for our customers, and what do we need to do to adapt and change? So we have accelerated through lots of maybe some of the things that may have already been in the pipeline to a certain extent, but certainly taken on board how our customers need to adapt and adopt some of these different technologies. Because the problem being is, the more you say you can't do this, you can't do that, users will look for workarounds. And that's the problem. So we want them to use the tools that we have put in place for them, use them in the right way. And this is really where the balance comes into play of security and productivity. So we don't want to just be shutting everything down. We actually want to take the opportunity to educate at the same time. And this is why we're very mindful of the fact is, yes, we can block a lot of these things. To Rob's point, actually, we can actually deploy lots of behavior analytics, lots of machine learning to look for this anomalous behavior. But actually what we want to do is help and educate the users. And that's why it's really important to then say, actually, this falls outside of policy, but this is why, this is what you can do, this is what you can do instead. So it's actually thinking about, how can we take all of those things on board and bake it in as much as possible into the tool set. So it's automated, we're thinking about all of these things. But just how do we enable what's coming? Because I think, as we were sort of saying, is we've very much been in a crisis management mode, and I think this process of remote working, flexible working, changes in working practices is going to continue, and that's where we as vendors and companies and obviously the financial services themselves really have to think about collectively, and the regulators, about what do we have to do to make sure that anything that we're putting forward is done in the right way. And we're thinking ahead in terms of any changes that might be coming from regulators or from our customers or wherever it might come from, and we can accelerate that innovation in those products to make sure that we are meeting those requirements as they're needed, not 6 months, a year down the road when it's too late.
Yeah, and look, and I think there's you kind of got the nail on the head, right? So you need to kind of get with the adoption piece to begin with, but also you need to kind of you need to move at pace, and you need to embed things at the same time. So it's not just about going and grab the thing, but it's also about embed it and get people on board with it.
Yeah.
I might throw a cheeky one to you, Joe. So to what extent is there a risk that over reliance on AI and RegTech compliance tools could lead to a false sense of security that open firms up to different challenges and risks, do you think?
So it's not one and done, right? Which I think is a fundamental message. You don't just put something in and walk away and the world is going to be automatically a better place. So with AI, as everybody knows who's on the call, you have to do some training, you have to do some testing, you have to do validation to ensure that it is delivering consistently the outcomes that you're looking for. So that's a critical stage, as too is making sure that you're working to the right use cases with the right data sets that can then test and validate those as being the outcomes. So you then reach a point where the system is working in the way that you would expect it to, and the system is delivering the outcomes that you are targeting. But you can't stop there, clearly. The world changes, and Greg and Rob have talked about the wave of different regulation historically, and what's coming through. The world changes, and therefore you need to react and adapt. And so continuous testing of it is going to be a critical element of anybody's deployment using AI. And that's why ultimately this is a combination of people and technology to ensure that you're driving the right outcomes.
To add to what Joe said, I think one of the things that we often over predict is how accurate humans are at a lot of these very, very repetitive tasks. A lot of tasks associated with compliance, with screening, compliance analysts who do the same task over and over and over. Humans are just naturally not very good at that and are very inconsistent. And so by bringing in the right AI technology, married with properly trained people, married with proper testing, you significantly increase the quality and consistency of your results. I think too much we think of humans being far less impervious to things like being hungry before lunchtime, being full after lunchtime, where we find that the results of screening, the results of those activities can be very, very biased based on those random things that humans either emotionally or internal biases. And through AI, through properly trained AI and properly developed RegTech, you can solve a lot of those problems and uncover a lot of risk you would have otherwise missed.
Yeah, it's a great point, Greg. And those I see it all the time where when we're implementing things that there's this kind of view that the human is doing it in a perfect way, and we're all human. We all know we don't operate that way, which is a really good point. Rob, I'm gonna come to you with a question that occurred to me while you're presenting, if that's okay. I'm be cheeky and throw a different one in, but lots of RegTech tools, and he says as a head of product for one, but lots of RegTech tools kind of target a really particular niche challenge, right? So they focus in on a particular area of compliance risk, and they try to provide a solution for that. Can they be made to work together, do you think? And what are the risks of adopting multiple kind of tools to cover lots of different ground and trying to bring all that together for the firms that we're ultimately, I guess, implementing into?
In short, yes is the answer. They can. I think we've been all at this long enough to have seen the different waves over the last 15-20 years or so of firms coming together and say we must have a centralized GRC platform, and then appreciating the challenges with the one size fits all. I think what RegTechs bring to the table is a best in class solution for, as you say, for these kind of niche areas, but they're also designed at a time where there's an appreciation for exactly what you've just spoken about, where Open API is available for the data which resides in the solution, makes it easy to integrate into other solutions, and of course bi-directional for changes then to come back into that solution. So we're seeing a number of firms that are actually stepping away from some of the traditional GRCs and moving to more kind of modern type GRCs, RegTech GRCs that help to aggregate different platforms and systems under one UI. But absolutely, I think that's the trend we're seeing right now. I think everyone will agree on this phone that there is that opportunity to have a best in class, have all functional groups happy with all their requirements met, but still have the kind of the benefit of data being shared around the business, so that everyone can appreciate that value.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rob. So I think we're going to close off with one final question, which I will cheekily throw to the floor and see who gets there first. One of the things that we've all talked about, or you guys have all talked about in your presentations in one way or another, is the pace of adoption, particularly this year, right? The pace of technology decisions, the pace of change, the pace of kind of some of those otherwise it would have been really big strategic decisions being taken reasonably quickly and at pace. I guess the question I would have is, given what we're starting to think about coming into the rest of this year and into next year, do you think that there's a risk that actually that technology adoption or that pace of acceptance of change and the risks associated with doing that quickly, will that pace slow down and kind of knee-jerk back the other way, and firms will find it harder to get some of these tech projects approved? Or do you think the trend is going to continue?
I think one of the things that a lot of RegTech firms have done, and it's something that's been a big focus for us, is how do you make it easier for these firms to get started? How do you make it where you're not spending $500,000 to go and implement a solution from the ground up, or $500 million, but start with a license, start with 5 seats, start with 10 seats, be able to grow and test and expand naturally, as you would with a lot of other B2B software. And so RegTech really needs to take that approach of, it's not, you have to be able, especially in these days, to be a lot more dynamic to growing naturally and growing with the risk need, rather than these huge, long 2-3 year sales cycles to hopefully close a 6 or 7 figure deal. It's a lot more about being agile, allowing financial institutions to test and grow naturally.
If I may just answer it slightly differently, Steve, and I'll keep this brief, but and it's kind of also an answer to the previous question. what we at Cube, and I think others will agree, we're not looking to replace that high value role that humans have in terms of, again, for us, in terms of reg change, reg monitoring. What we're looking to do is replace the time-consuming tasks, the laborious tasks around scouring regulatory websites, classifying that data when it's actually implied within the data itself. So that's the role that AI can play. And I don't see that changing. There's a lot of work at the front end that AI can do. So I see that trend continuing because there's a need, as I said, for firms to do more with less and do it faster. Hence why we're all here today.
Steve, just very quickly, I think what I'd say is if RegTech solve real, meaningful and valued problems, it's not going to slow down.
And Sarah, so I agree violently with all of that. Sarah, you opened us up, so why don't you close us off as well? Your views on that point.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. So I think really what we're seeing is actually lots of companies going forward, they're going to be driving lots of cost savings and efficiencies. I think one thing that COVID has taught us all is actually it's hit everyone really hard simultaneously. So actually what we need to be thinking about is how do you get the very best of what you've got? So before you start just knee-jerk reaction to new tools, new technologies and that kind of thing, what we want to be able to do is make sure that what you've current products and solutions you've already bought are working to their best extent possible. It may be that you then have to overlay certain things, but that's certainly where we're starting from. Is actually, we see lots of customers who've bought tool sets and bought different capabilities, but they're not using them to their full extent in terms of the way that they automate, integrate a lot of this information together. So that's really where we come from, is that education piece. Start there and then work forward in terms of addressing the gaps.
Yeah, amazing. Right. So I'm gonna bring us to a close there, guys. I really want to thank all of the speakers. You've done fantastic presentations and gave us plenty of ammunition to kind of ask some questions and some challenging ones as well. And you didn't do too badly in the Q&A either. So thank you for that. Without further ado, I'll hand back to you, Georgia, to kind of close us off, I guess. And you have the floor back. Georgia, you're still on mute, I'm afraid.
Thank you again, Steve, and all of the panel as well. Like I said earlier on, you saved me a job of chairing the event, so it's been the easiest RegTech talk that I've ever had to do. So I do really appreciate that. And everyone's insight as well. Like I said earlier on, we're going to be bringing all of the presentations together. We're going to be presenting a blog post, a write-up of the event on the RegTech Talk site, and I'm pretty sure there's going to be some content on the Record Show site as well. So thank you everyone for submitting all of your really insightful questions. I think that it's been a really insight-packed event, and hopefully we'll see some of you again soon, and we'll talk more about RegTech and regulatory compliance. Thanks very much, guys. I'm going to end that there.
Thank you.